You know, it's a rare occurrence these days that I get to talk about a banned movie that isn't a video nasty or some kind of weird European sex film. But today's the day, because today we're going to be taking a look at an egregious little shit of a movie that last year celebrated its 90th anniversary of being kicked out of all the cinemas. 1930's Ingagi, a film that deserves a swift kick to the nuts if it were at all possible to kick a film in the balls. But before we get ahead of ourselves, some backstory. The film began life as a collaboration between three gentlemen, William Alexander, Nat H. Spitzer and William Campbell. The group were well aware of the sharp rise in interest of documentary cinema, and in particular they were interested in the way that some documentaries staged activities rather than capturing them naturally. Sometimes it was because these events were few and far between, and sometimes, as was the case with films like Nanook of the North, because the practices they wanted to capture had fallen out of fashion due to modernisations, they tried to capture the old ways of doing it because it was seen as much more interesting than the newer ways. Based on this, the gang decided to make a film that was an entirely fabricated documentary following the adventures of explorer Sir Hubert Winsford and his team, as they explored uncharted portions of Africa. The idea was that Sir Hubert and his team would initially start on a normal trek across Africa, but when they hit Mombasa, they would hear the tale of the Ingagi tribe, and, well, get ready for a big fat dose of racism right here, because that's basically the heart and soul of this film. You see, Ingagi is the Kinyarwanda word for gorilla, and in this film, the Ingagi tribe are stereotypical natives who religiously worship the gorillas that live in the surrounding area. The tale goes that many years prior to this documentary, the Ingagi tribe were known to ostracise women who couldn't have children. These women would quite often be forced to go and live in the jungle away from the other tribe members. Once in the jungle, the women met with the gorillas and offered them fruit in return for their protection, and in the hope that the gorillas would in turn make them fruitful. They basically flat out say these women banged gorillas in the hope it would get them pregnant. The narrators describe these women as being ape-like after their time in the jungle, and says that some of the women were indeed fruitful, and that the offspring resembled half-human and half-ape oddities. So, you know, really fucking racist movie. Anyway, the legend goes that the local government eventually banned the practice of sending women into the jungle to bang gorillas because they can't have kids, but this in turn led to another problem, because the gorillas weren't now getting their steady stream of fruit-bearing naked ladies, and as such they started coming to the village and being aggressive. Because of this, a compromise was made whereby once a year a woman was offered to the gorillas as sacrifice in exchange for them staying away from the tribes for the rest of the year. And that's basically where the film picks up. Sir Hubert and company have arrived in Mombasa very close to the time of year that the sacrifice is committed. So him and the team decide to divert their overall attentions from what they were planning to do in order to see this strange ritualistic practice. And what follows is approximately an hour and 10 minutes of stolen stock footage intercut periodically with about 12 minutes of original footage shot in an LA backlot and in a woods just outside of LA. With narration from Sir Hubert that basically swings from being very racist to very patronising to very factually inaccurate. The vast majority of the film is Hubert's journey from Mombasa to the Ingagi tribe, and we don't actually get to the tribe, let alone any quote, gorillas, see here famous man in a monkey suit Charles Gamora, till 12 minutes off the end of the movie. I don't really even know where to begin with this thing if I'm being honest. It's a morally reprehensible work on almost every level, and the more I dug into this thing, the more awfulness I pulled out. So, as a start of a 10, when the film was previewed it was marketed as a real and true documentary. But one of the attendees at the preview screening recognised one of the native women as being from Central Casting. This information quickly spread through reporters and film critics of the time, and speculation began to grow that the film wasn't quite as true life as had been pitched by the producers. At the same time, once the film finally made it to cinemas, it was immediately picketed by protests both from the black community, who naturally found the thing fucking abhorrent, because it is, and from the American Mammalologist Society, who, on top of finding the racism abhorrent, also had issues with the accuracy of the information about the animals in the film, the gratuitous use of footage of animals being killed, gored, or chopped up, and the repeated implications of bestiality. The combination of letters from both protest groups and the revelation about the central casting actress eventually landed the film at the FTC's door. And bearing in mind, this film is pre-Hayes Code, so if your movie has kicked up enough shit that the FTC have to check you out before the film industry became wildly puritanical, you know things have gone very wrong very quickly. Anyway, the FTC did investigate and some huge revelations came out. It turned out that the entire film had been staged, that the on-screen Ingagi was largely unrelated stock footage or men in suits, and most critically of all, there was no such person as Sir Hubert Winsford. He'd been entirely made up by the producers. That and a huge chunk of the film contained silent-era movie footage of Africa that had been stolen from other reputable documentaries, in particular 1915's Heart of Africa, which, from my best understanding, was a somewhat sincere attempt to educate the US and Europe about the different African cultures of the time. Yeah, these guys stole footage from an, at the time, somewhat sincere documentary to make a very insincere faux documentary about how African people have sex with gorillas and act like savages, because these filmmakers were pieces of shit. As a wonderful piece of karmic retribution, this did all ultimately end up falling in on the filmmakers like a house of cards. The FTC made all of their findings public, and the part about the stolen footage eventually reached the director and cinematographer of Heart of Africa, Grace Mackenzie, who was horrified at what they'd done with her work, so much so that her son Byron dragged the filmmakers through the courts seeking compensation for damages that the film had caused to his mother's well-being and to her reputation. In 1932, the film was pulled from circulation by the FTC, and in 1933 came the dramatic final blow when the FTC finally outright banned the film, followed immediately by Grace and Byron winning their court case, resulting in the pair being awarded $150,000 in damages, which, when adjusted for inflation, would be something in the region of $3.4 million in today's money. The resulting lawsuits and federal charges left pretty much everyone involved penniless and shunned from the Hollywood system, with the vast majority of the people who worked on this film never working on anything ever again after 1933. So, sometimes there is justice. Outside of the blatant lies, nasty footage and racism though, my biggest complaint is that the film isn't even sensationalist in such a way as to be interesting. This thing is the cinematic equivalent of watching paint dry with your racist uncle. The dialogue is bland and largely only comments about what's on screen, the footage feels repetitive and largely there for padding, it's just shots of African tribes, shots of animals and shots of various rivers and forest life, often just thrown together seemingly on a whim. At an hour and 22 minutes long, this thing could have been half an hour and would have felt too long, with the other nefarious elements really just sealing the deal on what an absolute waste of time this was for everyone involved. The only thing this film really achieved is that it got a load of xenophobes out of the Hollywood system in one fell swoop, and allegedly some of the themes in this were an influence on the original King Kong. Though, even if that were the case, I don't think an hour and a half of blatant lies and disgusting comments or visuals could really justify this film's existence. The pacing is incredibly slow and drudging, it's unpleasant to sit through. The tone is surprisingly on point for documentary of that era, which is probably why, while a lot of people saw through it, a surprising amount took it at face value. There's no act structuring really, it feels like a long-winded monologue that doesn't have an off button. The fact the production was so confident about Ingagi's success that they tease a sequel at the end is jaw-dropping in light of the 80-ish minutes that preceded it. The script, by which I mean the narrated sequences, was written by Adam Shirk. He had 8 writing credits and he seemed to largely work in faux documentary and scare films. Ingagi would be his final written work and he passed away in July 1931. But a script that he was working on for the theatre, titled The Ape, was eventually adapted for the screen twice. Once in 1934's House of Mystery, and then again in 1940 as the Boris Karloff-led The Ape. The film was directed by William Campbell. He had 43 directing credits between 1916 and 1931. His work largely seemed to centre around silent-era short films, mainly comedy and faux documentary. Taking on Ingagi proved to be fatal to his career, as he only made one further film after it in 1932 before exiting the Hollywood system entirely. He passed away in February 1972 at the age of 87. As far as the direction and cine goes, given this film is almost entirely stock footage, I think the emphasis is eased off of the crew's technical ability and is really more centred around, does it make a convincing looking documentary? To which I'd say it kinda does. It makes for a convincing documentary in appearance, but a convincing bad documentary ultimately. As mentioned, this thing runs for way too long, has large gulfs where nothing particularly happens, has multiple moments where the documentarian is subjective rather than objective, it fails as a travelogue because it lacks anything interesting, and it fails as a documentary, even as a faux one, because it doesn't really tell you anything other than the documentarian's own beliefs. Because this film's a hodgepodge of stolen footage, often shot across different decades using different cameras with different fields of frame, the film's constantly juttering around with different film gates, grain textures and print qualities. It's fairly easy to tell the newly shot footage apart from the older footage, as it looks cleaner, sharper and has a wider gate than most of the other stock footage. But the quality of composition and how those shots work in a sequence swings wildly from scene to scene, as this thing was literally butchered together from whatever they could get their hands on. The new footage is, at best, just about competently shot. I won't go as far as to say visually good, because it isn't. But it blends in with the other footage fine enough when tinted to match the other footage's grading, and while it is cleaner, it's not so clean as to clearly strike apart from the rest of the film totally. At least, not consistently. Should I even really bother going into the performances? The narrator puts on a faux upper-class accent and refers to African people as primitive in various ways. When the actor playing Hubert is on screen, he's overly lively, as was the style for silent film back then, but he's on screen so little it's hard to really rate their performance. Equally, the only other people I could review performance-wise in these are the black cast, who were hired to play the natives alongside Sir Hubert. I'd like to think that they were taken advantage of rather than willingly being subjected to racist tirades, but yeah. Oh, and there's Charles Gamora as the guy in the gorilla suit at the end. He was well known for playing apes in movies. He does a fine enough job here, though he only admitted to playing Ingagi well after the film had been banned, and even then it was done with a slight twinge of embarrassment. It's basically a poor show all round. The soundtrack too is unremarkable, it's just background noise, something to stop the thing playing in total silence. It kinda fits the vibe the film's going for, but it's hardly defining. Part of the reason for that is because Ingagi on its initial run was sent to theatres in 2 parts. The film prints themselves were silent, but a series of gramophone records were also provided that contained the film's audio, alongside a special player that was attached to the projector. The idea being that there were cues in the film that caused the needle to drop on the record at the exact time required to keep the video and audio in lockstep. This proved overly complicated though, so some later prints made in 1931 and 32 were struck with different film tints applied, we go from heat red to jungle green, and had the soundtrack embedded onto the film strip for ease of playback. It's here actually that we do encounter some problems, as if my memory is correct, the records used for the first run of Ingagi had additional narration that was cut from later print runs that had the soundtrack embedded onto the film strip. But more on that shortly. Ingagi was banned in 1933 from being screened or broadcast, and it remained that way for the better part of 50 years. In the late 80s or early 90s, a print was recovered by Something Weird Video, who preserved it, and a very limited screening took place in the early 90s to a small audience. I have conflicting reports of any kind of TV broadcast for this one, so I'm gonna say that beyond a couple of private screenings, this thing properly didn't see the light of day again until 2021, when Kino Lorber and Something Weird Video teamed up with the Library of Congress to give the film a full 4K ground-up remaster. To do this, they made copies of the two prints they had, one an original interpositive struck from the original negative, and the other a first-generation copy of that interpositive that was used to form the second wave of prints struck for this movie, the one with the soundtrack embedded into the film print. The film was then assembled using the best elements of both prints. As the original recordings for the film couldn't be located, they used the embedded audio from the second run as the base. But that then meant there was some narration missing at random points in the film. To combat this, however, Kino and Something Weird added a subtitle option that would insert the missing audio as text to help fill in the gaps. Extras are a little thin on the ground here. There's an audio commentary, the missing audio subtitles, and a 4-minute feature showing the restoration process, and that's about as far as things go. It's a meatier package than some of these releases got, but a more thorough documentary of what happened behind the scenes with this film really would have taken things to the next level. In terms of remastering, they've done a hell of a job considering this thing's now over 90 years old. It's probably the best it'll ever look, but that's kind of a moot point given what this film deals with. Ingagi commits the worst crime that a film can commit. Not only is it deeply rooted in prejudice and sleaze, but it's so boring. It can't even make the sleaze entertaining. When I feel like I can confidently say that this film would make an excellent B-picture to Child Bride, I hope that helps to explain just how awful this film really is. Because when Child Bride is considered your headliner, you know shit went badly wrong. Not even worth checking out for the morbidly curious, Ingagi has one very minor claim to fame and a whole lot of nothing to show for it. It's a horrible, nasty little picture whose impotence outshines any other facet of its production. Don't bother. I probably won't watch this thing again, and you'd be saving yourself a lot of time, money, and hassle in not watching it either.